Hello and welcome to Living the Dream for General Practitioners, the podcast for doctors and clinic leaders who want to learn about pathways, strategies and opportunities for living and working in Australia. Join me, Gemma Gough, and my expert guests as we share stories, unlock the secrets to recruitment success, share tips for moving across the world, navigating new cultures and so much more. This show is brought to you by Health Recruitment Australia. Now sit back, relax and enjoy this episode. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 5 of our GP Recruitment Fundamental podcast series. Today I'm joined by Luke Edwards, an immigration lawyer from Work Visa Lawyers, a migration firm in Adelaide. Luke completed a Bachelor of Laws, Bachelor of Science and a graduate diploma in legal practice. He was admitted as a barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of South Australia in February 2018. He has been a part of the Work Visa Lawyers team since October 2017. During his studies of law, he pursued an interest in migration through undertaking courses in migration law and policy, as well as refugee law and policy. His main focus is on employer-sponsored visas and has extensive experience managing the 400 visa, 482, 494, 186 and 187 visas. Today, Luke and I are going to provide information about the immigration and visa process, what options could be available to you, and answer some of the questions we are both asked so often. Luke, welcome and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So I would assume one of the first questions you're asked, it's certainly one I'm asked frequently, is what visa am I eligible for and how does the process work?
Yeah, so it's a good question, a big one. The process sort of varies depending on which visa someone's eligible for, and eligibility can depend on their profile, their experience, their age, less so when we're talking general practitioners, but sometimes English language ability and things like that as well. So most commonly I would see general practitioners coming into Australia under the 482 visa program would be the most common. And then it's a temporary employer-sponsored work visa that's usually for a period of up to 4 years. And then after being on a 482 visa for some time, many doctors are then able to progress to permanent residency in Australia by applying for one of the permanent visas, such as the 186 employer-sponsored permanent visa, or other times the independent, not employer-sponsored options, which we usually call general skilled migration, or GSM for short, which is the 189 independent visa, or sometimes the 190 state-sponsored visas. Then obviously there's a big demand for doctors in Australia at the moment, so lots of states are quite interested to sponsor general practitioners and other doctors.
Excellent. So if a state decides to sponsor one of the GPs, is that essentially mean that they can work in any sort of medical facility within that state, or are they still required to work for one particular location?
So because it's not employer-sponsored under that program, it is a bit more independent. It does generally involve, in exchange for their nomination, most states will ask the applicant to commit to a period of 2 years living in that state, but there's flexibility to move around within there.
Amazing. So you mentioned there, Luke, you said the word nomination. Now there's often we're asked what's the difference between a nomination and an application. Could you explain the two?
Yep. So when we're talking the employer-sponsored process for the 482, the temporary visa, or the permanent 186 visa, I generally consider those are made up of two separate parts, the business part and the visa applicant or migrant's part. And so the nomination is the business part, which involves them setting out details about the business, why they need the position filled, why they're having difficulty locating GPs locally, and showing that they're a suitable business to nominate this position that they've had trouble filling. And then the visa part is on the GP side, where they put forward, this is me, I am who I am, verifying their identity, and also showing that they've got the skills to fill the position, showing their qualifications and work experience, and those sorts of things, as well as giving details of their family, and satisfying other visa requirements such as character, showing that there's no criminal record that might stop them getting in, or health assessments.
Fair enough. That sounds good. So can anyone nominate someone to come and work in Australia?
So I wouldn't say anyone. We often get asked about if people have family members and things that might already live in Australia. And most often that's not suitable for nominating the person. Generally speaking, if we're talking about GPs coming into Australia, we would usually be talking about the practice nominating the person. And if it's a sort of a practice that's been operating for a bit of time and has a good reputation and things like that, they're quite often suitable to nominate, but not everyone.
Sure. And I believe sort of a GP clinic, for example, would have to become a business sponsor before they could actually nominate someone. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So for the first time a practice is sponsoring someone, they would need to get a 5-year standard business sponsorship, which is a one-time application that then, like I said, lasts you 5 years, and you can sponsor multiple GPs or other roles if suitable under that. And then I picture it as the nominations sort of plugging into that head sponsorship.
That makes sense. I'm looking at my list of questions here, Luke. We've had a few from our GPs and clinics, so we'll work through those. How would a GP know which visa was right for them? Is that something they can put into the immigration website, or are they better to liaise with a immigration lawyer?
So it can depend. There's a lot of information on the department's website and elsewhere online, and a first step for a lot of people looking to move to Australia is looking through those options and seeing what might fit best. But it can sometimes be difficult to tell what's suitable for someone's particular occupation and how the nuances of that might work, as well as requirements around skills assessments and other more practical requirements about once you get here that might influence it. So, obviously, that's assistance we provide, guiding people on what their best option is.
Yeah, that's great. So in regards to those sort of the application itself, what documents would a GP need to have sort of to hand when completing the application?
Yep. So for the GP themselves, often they would need to show the APRA registration is a big one, and providing copies of that, whatever particular registration they might have, their official certificates. They'd also be required to provide their qualification certificates from where they did their bachelor or other qualification. They'd also be required for a lot of visas, especially if we're talking the 482 visa, has a 2-year employment experience requirement. So sort of a fresh graduate wouldn't be eligible for the 482 visa. They need to show 2 years of experience. In some cases, internships and things like that can count.
Okay, good to know.
But most commonly, that would look like a work reference from who the GP worked for during that time, and evidence of the payment they received. So those sorts of things showing that they're a skilled doctor to come and work in Australia. They'd also need to provide separately evidence of English ability. That's a requirement that APRA has themselves, and it's likely many doctors might have taken an English test already for that. And in many cases for doctors as well, their APRA registration having an English requirement means that their registration can also serve to meet the English requirement.
Perfect. And things like sort of health assessments and police clearances, I assume those would be sort of documents that would be required to upload as well.
And that's right. So police clearances are required from any country that you've spent 12 months or more in the last 10 years. For some people, that's a lot of countries. For other people, less so. But it is a process that can sometimes take the most fixed time. And so often people want to get that started sooner rather than later. Medical assessments can be done before the application is lodged or afterwards. It requires going to certain panel physicians that are chosen by the Department of Home Affairs in the person's current country they're in. And sort of you can't go to any local practitioner and get them to conduct it for you and send it through. The department has a back-end system that's all linked up digitally, and the panel physicians upload the results there. But it is required for all family members.
Yeah, that's good to know. Good to know. And there's obviously a cost involved in the visas, and then potentially to get those supporting documents like the police checks and the health assessments. I mean, perhaps you could share with us sort of the average cost of the visas at the moment.
Yeah. So if we're talking an employer-sponsored 482 visa, GPs fall in what we call the medium-term stream of that, which goes for longer, but correspondingly is a bit more expensive. And so that's approximately $3,000 Australian per adult, and almost $800 per child Australian that's included.
So something our listeners obviously need to consider as part of the bigger picture financial implications of migrating as well. So that's good to know.
Yeah, and when we're talking permanent visas as well, often they're a little bit more expensive, and are often more in the tune of about $4,500 for the main applicant, and sort of $2,000 for other adults included. So a little bit more expensive for that permanent stage.
Yes, yeah. And then how long before they're eligible for sort of citizenship then once they get their permanent residency? Because I'm assuming you can't jump from being a temporary resident straight to a citizen. You would need to have that permanent residency first. Is that right?
That's correct. Yep. And I guess to touch on the permanent stage in the middle, very recently, actually, just of last Saturday, Saturday, the 25th of November, just recently, the requirement has gone from 3 years working for your employer down to 2 years.
Wow, great.
For employer-sponsored permanent residency, which is obviously a big change. It's a whole year less.
Yeah,
and
we do talk in later episodes with a real estate agent, and we sort of touch on the eligibility to sort of purchase the home on a temporary visa. So that actually opens up that security for GPs when they are looking to put roots down here in Australia. That will certainly help to do that. So that's good. That's good to hear.
Yeah, so that's very good.
Once a GP has submitted their application, if they wanted to sort of amend that by adding in, another child or, and the in-laws or something like that, is that possible to do that?
Yeah, so that's a really important thing to consider. Generally, for Australian visas, only members of the family unit can be included. Most of the time, that is limited to partners and children, being minor children and adult children up to the age of 23 who are dependent on the family still. So not who've a 20-year-old who might have married and has a full-time job wouldn't be eligible to migrate with the family. But if they're still living at home and studying and those sorts of things, then they often can.
Up to the age of 23. That's good to know. Yeah, that's great. And can they submit their application at any point, or is there a trigger for them to submit their part? How does all that work?
Yeah, so in the visa application, if we're talking the 482 employer-sponsored temporary visa, in the visa application, the transaction reference number or TRN for the nomination needs to be provided. And when you enter that, the Australian government's online IMI account system won't actually let you lodge the visa until that nomination has been submitted. It also won't let you upload any documents ahead of time until that's been done. But once that's submitted, you can then submit the visa application after that. Many people will choose to wait until the nomination application is approved to have a bit more certainty when lodging their visa. But also plenty of applications I've assisted with, it can be expedient to lodge them both at around about the same time. Like we said, nomination first and then the visa shortly thereafter. And that means if both of them take about approximately 1 month to process, that's 1 month instead of adding those 2 months together to make a full 2 months, which means coming to Australia a bit sooner.
So what happens if you've you've submitted the nomination's been submitted and you decide you're going to be proactive and put in your application as well, but for whatever reason the nomination isn't approved, do you sort of lose your money from your application fee, or is there a way of claiming that back?
Generally, if the nomination's withdrawn by the sponsor or refused, it is possible to request a refund, and most commonly that the refund is approved for those visas, and that currently can be done, online. There's a particular mechanism for it, and requires providing a few documents and things like that. But it can sometimes take a month or so to get that back, but it is possible.
Okay, that's good. And what if you apply and you've paid the fee and you just decide that you don't want to move? Do you lose that money, or can you get a refund for your application at that stage?
If it's just change of mind, unfortunately, generally not. The provisions for refund are quite limited, and so if you withdraw the application, if the nomination has been approved already and you withdraw the application, or the visa's being granted and you just decide not to come, generally you'll have a year to arrive for the first arrival on the visa. But for employer-sponsored 482 temporary visa, it's a condition that you sort of arrive reasonably quickly.
Okay, well, that's good to know. So a GP really needs to be fully committed then really to the move, or risk losing that application fee. So again, another consideration for the listeners. So that's also good to know. What are the waiting times at the moment? So nomination and the application have both been submitted. What sort of time are we looking for to hear on those?
Yeah, so sort of like we said before, some nominations are approved within a couple of days even, sometimes up to a few weeks or a month. And I'd say most commonly for the 482 visas, we're seeing sort of a few weeks to a few months, maybe 2 or 3. The Australian government has been working very hard on clearing out their backlogs and improving processing times. And I think not in all categories are we seeing that just yet, but in employer-sponsored visas, that seems quite clear at the moment. And especially given the high demand for GPs in Australia, I'd say applications by GPs are looked at quite quickly and tend to go faster.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We've worked with some GPs recently, and it's been less than a week turnaround, which has been quite mind-blowing considering a few years ago it would have been sort of 4 or 5 months before we would hear anything. So that's great for Australia, great for the need of having the GPs in here. So that's super. We touched a little bit on nominations and applications being rejected. We've talked about how they can get their money back. What about appeals? So if it's, if a nomination or a visa application has been rejected, is there an appeal process, or is the department's decision final?
Most commonly, where an applicant is overseas and their visa is refused, there's generally not an ability to appeal that. On a more practical level as well, even in some circumstances where appeals are possible, such as where an employer's nomination is refused, it's currently about 3 years wait before that appeal will be heard. And so for most employers, even though with the expensive Skilling Australians Fund levy for employers, the additional expense can be worth it when we're talking a couple of days to say, redo job advertising and resubmit a better application. The few thousand compared to a few years is usually a good trade-off, and I'd expect most GPs would be unlikely to wait a couple of years to see how that goes.
Absolutely. We've covered quite a bit, Luke, in this chat. Is there anything you think that we haven't covered that our listeners should know?
That's a good question. Nothing in particular that jumps to mind.
Yep, that's good. So it's likely information overload for our listeners, all of which has been incredibly helpful. If our listeners would like to speak to you directly about anything that we've covered today, or they would like the assistance of work visa lawyers for their migration, how can they get in touch?
Yeah, I'd say the best way to reach us is at our email address info@workvisalawyers.com.au. Yeah, we would be happy to hear from anyone that needs help.
Great. Well, that's amazing. Thank you so much for joining me today, Luke. I've really enjoyed our chat. It's been really, really helpful. I hope it gives our listeners a little bit more confidence in the migration process, knowing there are professionals like you and your team available to help them. And that's a wrap for today, everyone. Our next episode will be all things money. I'll be meeting with Kim Nitschke from Nitschke Nancarrow Chartered Accountants, where we will discuss how, as a GP, you can set up your business here in Australia, how to make the most of your money, and so much more. I look forward to you joining me then. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to Living the Dream for General Practitioners. Don't forget to subscribe on your favourite podcast player so you don't miss an episode. At Health Recruitment Australia, we want to see more happy GPs, thriving medical practices and healthy communities. If you'd like to join us on our mission, visit healthrecruitmentaustralia.com.au to explore opportunities and get in touch. Thanks for listening.